A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to bid you a warm welcome to this first of Sam Memorial's lecture. So on behalf of the Board of Trustees who are here present and the Moyo family who are here present, would like to all bid you welcome. We are very lucky that Sam's eldest daughter brought in a new member of the Moyo clan. There's a granddaughter of Sam who's here. So she's here to witness it all. So we're very lucky. I'm always reminded that Sam was one person who always encouraged us to take advantage of the spaces that are open. And over the years, in the 80s, we took advantage of the spaces that we created. We created quite a lot of things that assisted us in the community. For instance, things like the creation of Zero Regional Environment, network of experts, which incorporated people from Zimbabwe and around the region. And, over the time, we also broadened this, experience and also consummate desire for social justice by the formation of the African Institute for Agrarian Studies, which is why we are here today. In addition to that, other than just pursuing his academic research focus, Sam was involved in a lot of stuff assisting governments and international organizations on an advisory capacity, whether it was within the government of Zimbabwe, South African government, the UN, World Bank, etc. I recall one of the last such assignments that we did was in 2014, where we were a team of one of the most illustrious of Zimbabweans cadres on land issues, including the likes of Professor Rukuni, Professor Rudo Kaizano, Caleb Epidengu, Vudzijena, the whole gamut, Prosper Matondi, all those kind of people that sometimes we don't use them in Zimbabwe, but we use them elsewhere in the region. And those are the kind of things that we used to do on this basis. But Sam also will be remembered by his professional friends and colleagues, because he not only served within the region, but far abroad. You may remember that he met his demise in India in the course of furthering the interests of the agrarian South. And so we are, as we can witness from the crowds that are in here, we've got participants who've come to our summer school from far and wide, far as Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. So in recognition of these broad tentacles that he had developed, the IAS Board of Trustees, which then consisted of Temba Maduleke sitting here from South Africa, Kojo Amano, where's Kojo? Oh, Kojo from Ghana, and Mike Diambo from Kenya, who's not here with us, and Doris Kosana from South Africa. We decided to broaden this mandate in order to incorporate other members from the agrarian South by incorporating Mzee Issa Shivji from Tanzania, and Paris Heros from Brazil, and what's Praveen? Praveen Jha from India, and Dozi Chikata from Ghana. So that was in recognition of his interest in the agrarian South. And so we are lucky to have this broadened board representation. Currently, we do not have an executive director, which was left vacant by Sam's demise. But however, we're using the good offices of Issa Shivji, who's an honorary executive director, ably assisted by Walter Chambati. And for that, we would also like to thank them for putting this thing together. And right, for the rest, we are privileged to have a guest of honor today, but for that, I'll leave over to Mzee Issa Shivji.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you very much for I think the notes that you made on iPad helped, you know. You could keep to time. Comrades and colleagues, without indulging in cliches, I can sincerely say that it's a great honor to introduce to you giant of an intellectual, not only an intellectual, but a public intellectual. Not only a public intellectual, but a Marxist public intellectual. And that is saying a lot. Professor Prabhat Patnaik of course has all the achievements of an academic to his credit. He has published over a dozen or so books. Maybe I did not count well, maybe 2 dozen. Numerous articles in scientific journals. But more important for me, hundreds of articles in newspapers and public fora. And he is at ease to communicate with his fellow academics and intellectuals as much as with the public. Prabhat is a great teacher. He's a passionate teacher. He taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University for 36 years, one of the finest universities in India. No wonder that the first target of attack of Modi was JNU. Fascists know what to attack, and they attack centers of ideological contestation. Before he joined JNU, he taught for 5 years at the University of Cambridge, after getting his doctorate from the University of Oxford, from Oxford University. I said that Prabhat is a passionate teacher and likes teaching. I'm told that even after retiring, out of his great love and affection, he still walks into the lecture theatres to give lectures. And under him, a whole generation of very fine political economists were trained. I know a couple. Among them, of course, is our own Praveen Jha. You can see, I guess it's part of the Indian tradition, when Praveen talks about Prabhat, his eyes glisten, you know. You know, there is tradition of guru and chela, guru and disciple. But we also have it in Tanzania. Teachers are highly respected, they are very high status in our society, and no wonder our first president gave himself the title of Mwalimu, teacher. I do not want to go into academic achievements of Prabhat, but I would like to point out 2 attributes which really impressed me. Prabhat throughout has been a consistent Marxist. There was a time in the academy when you could not openly call yourself identified with Marxism. Some Marxists changed colors, they became postmodernists and subalterns. Others went underground. But Prabhat consistently has remained a Marxist and consistently has used that methodology not only to analyze but also to advocate causes for which he has stood throughout his life. The second attribute is his humility, disarming humility. He's a very humble person. So humble that sometimes you wonder how to react. Not only humble with colleagues, but also with his students and the younger generation. Some time ago, my daughter Natasha was attending a seminar at Columbia University. And together with her fellow students, they were looking at this poster announcing the lecture that was going to be given by Professor Prabhat Patnaik. And suddenly she found that someone was tapping her shoulder. So she turned around and it was Prabhat. So they warmly greeted each other. After Prabhat had left, Natasha tells me that a fellow student started asking, who's the Professor Patnaik? Really? Unbelievable for them. Because American academic is extremely hierarchical. That's not how you relate to professors, I'm told. But not Prabhat. Prabhat and his partner, Utsa Patnaik, another very fine person. I had the honor to be acquainted with her. Together with a comment by David Harvey and their response, it has now been published as a book, The Theory of Imperialism, by Columbia University Press. In that article, Prabhat and Utsa developed a very novel thesis, challenging a hitherto dominant narrative in the left, even in the Marxist left, of the transformation from feudalism to capitalism in Britain with an agrarian revolution which fed into the industrial revolution. We've all been taught and we read about the enclosure movement. We threw out the peasants, and then the peasants became the proletariat. This was the dominant narrative. Prabhat and Utsa challenged that. They in fact argued, very boldly in my opinion, that there was no such thing as agrarian revolution in Britain. What actually happened was that it was the tropical colonial countries which supplied cheap raw materials but cheap food which fed the proletariat and which cheapened the labor power of the proletariat. And that was the basis of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Not only that, but very often we are told that your people who are thrown out of land will be absorbed in your industries. They argue nothing of the sort happened. Actually, the surplus population of Britain was exported to the colonies, Australia, New Zealand, and other settler colonies. That's how they managed the surplus population. And when I read that, I was reminded of a book which I read many years ago when I was still a student, called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, by Lenin. Somewhere in that book, Lenin quotes Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, of course you know the name. This country was called Southern Rhodesia, and Zambia was called Northern Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was attending East London, and there was a large meeting, all the unemployed, poor, all crying for bread. And Cecil Rhodes said that there is a danger there. There is a danger there. If you want these people not to riot against you, you have to send them to colonies. You need colonies. And by God, he did colonies. He did colonize and brought the surplus population to this country. So, in a sense, Prabhat and Utsa's theory is validated from horse's mouth of what happened. David Harvey was invited to write a comment, I guess by the publishers on that. I read it. I found it so patronizing. Forget the arguments, one can argue, one can differ. But I found it so patronizing. And the only way I could express my anger was unfollow him on Twitter. But to my surprise, when I had read the response from Utsa and Prabhat, I was totally disarmed. Nowhere there was anger, even between the lines. Nowhere there was polemics. They soberly made their point. And I said, my God. And I could not withstand it, but they did. And I think that is a great mark of a humble, modest intellectual, and, in my view, a profound intellectual. Because arrogant intellectuals are usually not very profound. And that is why they have to hide it behind their arrogance. Comrades and colleagues, those few remarks, I have the great pleasure to present to you our first Sam Moyo Memorial Lecturer, Professor Prabhat Patnaik.
Professor Isa Shivji, members of Sam Moyo's family, members and chairman of the Board of Trustees, comrades and friends. It is a sad occasion for me that I am having to give a memorial lecture for Sam Moyo. He was an outstanding economist, totally committed to the cause of the oppressed, who was snatched away from us in his prime. It is particularly sad for me because it happened at a time when he was visiting my university for a seminar, in the course of which we had interacted and had actually had my last conversation with him just a few hours before the accident that took him away from us. In choosing the topic for this lecture, I have therefore chosen a subject which I think Sam would certainly have been interested in, namely globalization and the peasantry in the South. The term peasant is not very fashionable these days. It is hardly much used, and there is even a suggestion that the peasants do not exist. In my view, however, the peasants constitute an extant reality, and of course reality does not change in conformity with fashions regarding how it is observed from outside. Consequently, I would continue to use the term peasant. Of course, it is very important in today's context to define the term peasant, because we live in a world which has changed greatly. In the old days, the term peasant meant something very simple, namely anybody who was engaged, who had an operational only, who actually operated on a piece of land with some rights on that piece of land, and who used or put in a certain amount directly on his own or through family members, manual labor on that piece of land. So firstly, a peasant had some rights on the land, and secondly, the peasant engaged in some amount of manual labor. These two distinguished the peasants, these two features, from landlords or gentlemen farmers who tended to have land and operated on capitalist lines and so on. And of course, this simple definition would no longer suffice because of the fact that with increasing mechanization, manual labor becomes more difficult to define. a problem which Lenin himself had faced in discussing American agriculture in his book on new data regarding the laws of development of capitalism in agriculture. If you drive a tractor, if you drive a combine harvester, are you engaging in manual labor? If the answer is yes, then of course a whole lot of capitalist farmers and capitalist landlords would have to be considered peasants. Then the entire distinction is something which becomes pointless. I would therefore suggest a twofold definition, and here I am actually basing myself on the Indian experience, a twofold definition of the following kind. First, a peasant is a person with some rights on land who puts in manual labor. And second, a peasant is a person who derives the bulk of his or her income from agricultural operations, or operations involving agriculture and allied activities like livestock and so on. One of the features that you find in India is that there is a substantial diversification by landlords, capitalist farmers, gentlemen farmers, to other kinds of non-agricultural occupation operations like cinema halls, trade, and so on. But a peasant is one who actually still derives the bulk of his or her income from agricultural operations or allied activities. Based on this dual definition of the peasantry, I contend that we have a sizable segment of the peasantry in the world. And again, if I base myself on some very crude calculations in India, they would go as follows. Roughly in India, half the total workforce is engaged in agriculture. Let us assume that a third or so of this workforce consists of land-based laborers. They are not operating holdings of any kind. They are simply land-based laborers. Let's assume about 5% constitute capitalist elements, in which case roughly 60% of this half of the workforce can be categorized as peasants. And that, in the Indian context, therefore implies that 30% of the total workforce consists of peasants. Now that's no mean a number. And consequently, the suggestion that the peasants as a category are no longer relevant, have disappeared and so on, is a suggestion which I certainly cannot subscribe to. The question is that when we look at this peasantry, there was an old way of looking at this peasantry, which was again something which we owe to Lenin, and which virtually sustained all revolutionary struggles throughout the 20th century. Lenin, in his book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, drew a distinction between two different cases of transition to capitalism. One, which was typified by France, where actually the bourgeoisie, in the bourgeois revolution that occurred from 1789 onwards, actually smashed feudal estates, distributed feudal estates among the peasantry, and consequently the peasants' desire to be liberated from the feudal yoke. And this incidentally stood the bourgeoisie in good stead, because one of the reasons the Paris Commune was defeated was precisely because the bourgeoisie enlisted the support of the peasantry against the proletariat that was rising up in the Paris Commune. Against this, Lenin argued, in the context of Russia, this is true of all countries that come late to capitalism, that countries coming late to capitalism is characterized by the fact that the bourgeoisie feels threatened that any attack on feudal property might rebound into an attack on bourgeois property. As a result, it does not carry out land redistribution and the smashing of feudal estates that bourgeoisie had done in the classical period of bourgeois revolutions. On the contrary, it enters into an alliance with the landed interests so that property as a whole could be defended, and this happens even at the expense of the peasantry. Therefore, the democratic aspirations of the peasantry, Lenin had argued, can be carried forward only in a revolution led by the proletariat through a worker-peasant alliance, And that democratic revolution would not, of course, only stop at the stage of democratic revolution, but it will lead on to socialism through a process of continuous revolution, in the course of which the allies of the proletariat would be changing, the allies of the proletariat within the peasantry would be changing. Now, this was basically an idea which meant that in the new era, a worker-peasant alliance led by the proletariat was required even for carrying out the democratic revolution, because the bourgeoisie was no longer capable of doing so. This basically meant, and in all third world countries, socialism was not something which was, as it were, irrelevant, not on the agenda and so on. Socialism was relevant because the democratic revolution was relevant. It could be carried out only by the proletariat, and the proletariat was not going to just stop at that, but in fact it would lead on to a socialist revolution. So in a sense, socialism, whether immediately as the immediate item on the historical agenda, or over a period of time through a protracted process, came onto the agenda according to the Leninist conception of every country, whether they were developed capitalist countries or whether they were underdeveloped underdeveloped capitalist countries of the third world. Now, it is on this basis that, of course, this democratic revolution, which the proletariat was supposed to carry out, was named differently in the context of different countries. The Chinese literature referred to it as the New Democratic Revolution. Mao called it the New Democratic Revolution. Elsewhere it was called the People's Democratic Revolution and so on. But no matter what, this conception of a democratic revolution, which was different from that which the bourgeoisie had led in the classical period, is a conception that underlay much of the revolutionary struggle throughout the 20th century. Now, of course, we know in retrospect the enormous difficulties that have arisen in countries like China, for instance, in making the transition between the democratic revolution and socialism. That's not an issue that I want to go into because that requires specialized discussion on its own. But I'd like to say that today, therefore, we still, on the Leninist conception, view the agrarian question as one of liberating the peasantry and the landless peasants and laborers from the stranglehold and the social power of the old landed interests, from the land concentration in their hands and from the social power concentration that arises because of law, is associated with land concentration in traditional societies. Therefore, the Leninist conception actually saw the agrarian question as consisting essentially in liberating the peasantry from the stranglehold of the landlords. Now, this was true not only in the pre-war period, in the pre-decolonization period, but this was also seen to be true even subsequently in countries like India, where the bourgeoisie, after decolonization, did come to power. It was suggested that while the bourgeoisie, having come to power, did not, as Lenin had predicted, did not smash the old feudal interests, did not distribute feudal property, did not therefore carry out any radical land redistribution. It actually made a kind of alliance with the landlord class, carried out a certain degree of land reforms, which was meant to facilitate capitalist development in agriculture, arising from both ends, namely peasant capitalism from below, with some rich peasants moving up who now got rights over land, and of course landlord capitalism, namely or Junker capitalism, those landlords who actually were became the allies of the bourgeoisie, were landlords who were persuaded to become capitalist landlords from being purely feudal landlords. So even in these societies, however, it was believed that the problem of landlordism remained, and the landlords were in fact the main issue when it came to the agrarian question. Now, this had a certain validity. The validity consisted in the fact that the post-decolonization dirigist regime, the post-decolonization regime that carried out planning and state intervention and so on, was a regime that actually kept out international big business, international agribusiness, as well as domestic big business from the agrarian sector. You had, of course, a process of primitive accumulation of capital going on in agriculture, but that primitive accumulation of capital took the form of the landlords evicting tenants in order to resume land for cultivation along capitalist lines. So you actually had a process of primitive accumulation, you actually had the state promoting capitalist development, but this was within the agricultural sector itself. There was no outside capitalists coming into agriculture in order to, certainly not outside big capitalists coming into agriculture in order to push agriculture in the capitalist direction, in order to carry out a process of primitive accumulation of capital from outside. Now this, therefore, still meant that the landlords could be seen as the main issue in the process of agrarian, in the resolution of the agrarian question. But this has, to my mind, changed with globalization. It has changed with globalization because of the fact that the kind of insulation that the dirigist regime had provided to the agricultural sector is no longer there. Earlier, the insulation and the attempt to promote capitalist development took the form of the state doing a number of things. Agriculture was protected from the vicissitudes of world market price fluctuations. There were quantitative restrictions on trade, and in addition we also had very high rates of tariff, and consequently the domestic agricultural prices were completely insulated from the world market prices. The domestic agricultural prices for a whole variety of crops, I'm talking about India, but this would be true in varying degrees in a number of third world countries, the domestic agricultural prices were sustained, for instance, supported to be remunerative by the state, which intervened in various ways in the market, both for food and for cash crops. You had a subsidization of inputs, input prices were kept low, and of course in India, after the nationalization of banks, credit was also provided at low rates as far as agriculture is concerned. There was substantial increase in public investment in irrigation and other kinds of activities. You also had substantial research and development being undertaken under state aegis in order to develop new agricultural practices, new kind of varieties of seeds and so on, which all led to the Green Revolution at a later period. You had a publicly controlled extension service that would actually carry these new processes and practices to the peasants at large. All this, of course, helped the rich peasants and the landlord capitalists to a much greater extent, but the point is that the state intervened and prevented, insulated this sector from encroachment either by international agribusiness or by domestic big capital. Now this is gone. Now what you find is agricultural prices domestically are linked to the world market price fluctuations, because of which you have real kind of movements. You have a situation where institutional credit, again, I'm talking about in India after bank nationalization, institutional credit doesn't go to agriculture. You have the peasants now relying on private money lenders who charge exorbitant interest rates. You have a situation where there is no price support naturally. You have international agribusiness now coming and providing seeds. Public extension services have gone. There is a direct relationship between the domestic big capital as well as the international agribusiness and the peasantry at large. The insulation that was enjoyed earlier is something which is completely gone. Now this going of the insulation has also meant that a process of primitive accumulation of capital has been unleashed, which is quite different from what was happening earlier. What was happening earlier, as I said, is that within the sector, maybe you evict some tenants and so on in order to resume land for capitalist cultivation. But now what you find is that on top of that, which is still going on, you have a much bigger process, far more important process, whereby international agribusiness, domestic big capitalists are really intervening directly to squeeze the entire agricultural sector in order to carry out a process of primitive accumulation of capital, whose impact is not felt by the capitalist elements, because as by definition, as I said earlier, they are diversified into cinema halls and trade and shops and so on, because of which they do not feel the pinch as much as the peasantry. Not surprisingly, in this kind of a situation, with no price support, with prices moving up and down, it is not only the small peasants who are affected, even the somewhat better off peasants are affected, and in India certainly 300,000 peasants have committed suicide, as you know, over the last 2 decades, because they borrow in order to develop cash crop production, but on the other hand prices crash and they can't pay back their loans and they commit suicide. Against which then you can cite evidence that look at the rate of growth of a number of third world countries. I mean, I'm not saying immediately, but let's say over the last few years, look at the kind of technological progress which has taken place, and given all these, how can you say that this is a mode of production that has become obsolete? The view that we have to see capitalism as being historically not obsolete as long as there is production, development of the productive forces taking place, production is increasing rapidly, is a view which I call productionism. I believe that productionism is an incorrect understanding of Marxism. Let me just give you an example. Lenin, in his book on imperialism, refers to capitalism as moribund. And what was the index of being moribund? Not rate of growth. The figures of rate of growth never occur in Lenin's imperialism. And what is more, economic historians now tell us that Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia, was growing very rapidly. In fact, many economic historians now say that Russia was growing very rapidly is a revolution that actually thwarted Russia's growth. So Lenin was, and the Edwardian boom was there before the kind of, the First World War. So it's not as if capitalism had really somewhere run aground as far as growth rate is concerned. Technological progress, you find some of the most outstanding technological innovations in human history, like the aircraft, like the automobile, were all actually happening in that very period. But that didn't prevent Lenin from calling capitalism moribund. Why did he do so? He saw it as a system that was unleashing wars on humanity, in which workers in the advanced capitalist countries are being made to kill fellow workers across the trenches. Third world recruits who were cannon fodder were being used to kill either workers from advanced capitalism. And of course, together with their migration, there was an export of capital from the metropolis that was complementary to the emigration of labor, and that gave rise to a massive diffusion of capitalism all over. Now, consequently, let me just give you one figure. Just take Britain. Between 1815 and 1910, the annual emigration from Britain to the temperate regions of settlement, to what I would call the colonies of settlement as opposed to colonies of conquest like India and so on, was roughly every year half of the total increase in population. So half the total increase in population in numerical terms was actually emigrating. If you make a similar calculation, for instance, then it would follow that in India, between independence and now, 400 million people at least should have emigrated if a similar scale is to be observed. Now, of course, Arthur Lewis talks about 50 million Europeans migrating out of Europe in the 19th century. Difficult to say, but whether it's actually 50 million or less. But on the other hand, the fact is that certainly in the case of Britain, this calculation which I'm providing is absolutely true. So there was a very substantial immigration that took place, and it is that which meant that those displaced petty producers did not all have to get absorbed into the active army of labor, because they had plenty of possibilities of going elsewhere. And of course they went elsewhere, got rid of the local population, got hold of land, set themselves up as farmers, which is why also the reservation wage in Europe went up, because the alternative was that you could migrate to the New World and set yourself up as a farmer with a certain reasonable standard of living. It is that rather than the agricultural revolution which was really responsible for the fact that you found high levels of income within the agriculture, and for that matter generally as far as the wage earning population is concerned, compared to what you found in countries which were colonies of conquest, where not only did you have de-industrialization occurring because of the import of manufactured goods from Lancashire and elsewhere, but you additionally had this process of drain. Much of the drain was actually used for financing. By drain I mean the unilateral extraction of surplus was used for financing the capital exports from the metropolis to these regions of settlement. If you look at the kind of employment which is being generated today, India, for instance, is supposed to be an emerging superpower, high rates of growth and so on. And it's true that over a certain period, India has had a 7 to 8% GDP growth rate. During that period, 2004-5 to 9-10, if you take the rate of annual increase in what is called usual status employment, there are different categories in which people are categorized, and so the surveys ask a question: do you consider your usual status as one of being employed? The number of people who say yes are then called usual status employment. The rate of growth of usual status employment, which is really in some sense the true index of the rate of growth of employment, was 0.8% in a period the economy was growing at 7 to 8% GDP annually. 0.8% is well below even the natural rate of population growth. So let alone absorbing displaced petty producers, you are not even able to absorb, despite high rates of 7 to 8% growth rate, the number of persons who are actually constituting the natural increase in the workforce. And consequently, the idea that this process of primitive accumulation of capital is something which only has a transient effect, we need not shed tears about it. And this is a view very widely held by very many people I greatly respect. They also feel that this is something which is only a transient phenomenon. We shouldn't worry too much about it. These are only the costs of, the transitory costs of growth. Now, to the extent that is not true, then it implies that the agrarian question now has to be seen in a much wider sense than the way that Lenin had seen it. The way Lenin had seen it is that the agrarian question consisted of meeting the democratic aspirations of the peasantry by eliminating landlordism, land concentration, the social power of the landlords. But now it has to be seen additionally also in terms of the fact that this entire process of primitive accumulation of capital, unleashing of international agribusiness and domestic big business on the agricultural sector must be stopped. In other words, you have to have a process of protection and promotion of peasant agriculture against the encroachments which are happening from outside. Now, to do this, I talked about suicides. What is called the agrarian crisis is nothing else but actually primitive accumulation of capital being reflected in this crisis. Now, if so, then tackling the agrarian question today would require a very different perspective on a number of things. It would require a different concept of development. It would require a different assessment of capitalism, and it will also require a different assessment of globalization. And in fact, my own view is that the current crisis of the left all over the world is precisely because it has not done this different assessment and so on and so forth. Let me just briefly discuss each of these. One of the legacies of neoliberalism has been to identify development with a high rate of GDP growth. Okay. And then it is argued that since for development, for a high rate of GDP growth, you need a lot of investment. Investment must be facilitated, and to facilitate investment, you need land, and therefore the process of primitive accumulation of capital and the dispossession and the impoverishment of the peasantry is justified because of the fact that it is a requirement for development. Now, if, however, we know that this kind of development actually gives rise not just to transitional pains on the part of displaced petty producers, but it gives rise to a kind of increase in absolute poverty, gives rise to, of course, massive increases in inequality, permanent pain on the part of a whole lot of peasants and petty producers, then we have to define development differently. Even if you give the minimum definition of development, namely, that development must consist of ensuring employment to everybody at a living wage, which keeps increasing as labor productivity in the society increases, and also ensuring that certain basic services like education and health and so on are freely available with a certain quality to every citizen. Just take these two minimal components of development, then it's very clear that this kind of development is really impossible with the GDP growth that we are having, because far from providing employment to everybody at a living wage, is actually generating massive unemployment. Consequently, our very perspective, our very notion of development has to be altered. Now, if our notion of development has to be altered, then it's also very clear that development as we would like to see it is really impossible under capitalism, because neoliberal capitalism, which is the latest form of capitalism, is actually generating is having consequences which are actually negating development, which constitute negations of development, and therefore the idea of expecting development under capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism, which is the highest level of capitalism we have reached so far, is, because it is under the aegis of international finance capital, which is the highest form that capital has taken so far, is something which is a chimera. Now, if that is true, then of course, substantial elements of humanity, particularly those living in third world countries, have to visualize a society beyond capitalism, which amounts to saying that capitalism has become historically obsolete. Now, this view is something which would be contested by many Marxists. They would contest it on the grounds that if you look at Marx's preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, then Marx, you remember, had said that like earlier modes of production, a mode of production comes to an end when the development of productive forces is no longer possible within the relations of production that that particular mode of production entails. In line with that, it would follow that actually capitalism itself becomes historically obsolete, only coming to grips with the fact that this system is one which is thwarting human freedom, including the freedom to live a life of dignity for vast masses of population. That's when it goes moribund, irrespective of what the rate of growth of output may be. Now, on the basis of this, then one can say that we have to not only change the conception of development, we have to change our assessment of the potentials of how we evaluate the potentials of capitalism, and what is more, of course, we have to change our understanding of globalization. Globalization is one which is necessarily associated with an accentuation of the process of primitive accumulation of capitals all over the world. In fact, I once wrote an article in which I used the term accumulation through encroachment in order to distinguish this from from Marx's volume 2 kind of accumulation, which I call accumulation through expansion. I was talking about the fact that accumulation occurs not only at the expense of petty producers, but also at the expense of the public sector. Getting hold of public sector assets for a song is something which is also a part of the accumulation through encroachment. Public sector assets belong to the people at large. That is also a kind of primitive accumulation of capital. But since I'm talking here only about peasant agriculture and petty production, I'll keep talking about primitive accumulation of capital. It would follow, therefore, that globalization is one which unleashes, to a much greater extent, this process of primitive accumulation of capital, and consequently, primitive accumulation of capital, instead of being necessary for development, constitutes a negation of development. That we cannot call development if it is associated with a massive process of primitive accumulation of capital. If so, then it becomes essential to think in terms of a worker-peasant alliance, a state based on the worker-peasant alliance that actually plays the role of not only breaking landlordism, but also of preventing this process of primitive accumulation of capital. Industrialization, yes, but for industrialization, it is not necessary that there should be primitive accumulation of capital. Industrialization can occur through peasant cooperatives, for instance, voluntarily created cooperatives as far as the peasants are concerned, that itself could own industrial units. Somebody this morning was talking about this happening in China, and in fact, there is no reason why we should not think along these lines. And what is more, even if outside capital is required to enter the countryside in order to set up industrial units, there is no reason why cooperatives of peasants, in which I include landless peasants, should not also be owning equity in these, so that they can directly control and supervise what is going on in these particular units. In order to have such cooperatives, there has to be a degree of egalitarianism in the countryside, for which again land redistribution becomes essential. So the agenda of land redistribution does not recede to the background. On the contrary, it constitutes the basis for developing something new. Now I think that we therefore have to look at the agrarian question differently. We therefore have to look at the entire process of our relationship to globalization differently. If we have a state of workers and peasants that prevents primitive accumulation of capital, that ensures development in the sense I have been talking about, this state, in order to acquire elbow room for itself, would have to delink itself from the process of globalization. Because if it is the case that you actually have freedom of capital flows, freedom of trade flows, the moment a government comes to power that announces such measures, Moody's are going to downgrade you. When Moody's downgrade you, there will be massive outflow of capital. You will have a financial crisis before you have actually even begun. Therefore, it becomes essential for any alternative agenda of the kind I'm talking about that there has to be a process of delinking from globalization. That raises a host of questions. That delinking cannot be done by every small unit, but it is something that requires, as we discussed in the morning, there's a Pan-Africanism that requires a minimum size of cooperating nation states. But in order to bring about the revival of a nation state which is different from the neoliberal state, which is in fact based on a worker-peasant alliance committed to an alternative trajectory of development, a degree of delinking becomes important and necessary. At any rate, I believe these are issues that have to be really thrashed out and thought as far as the left and progressive opinion everywhere is concerned. And one of my criticisms is that the left has not done this sufficiently, and this is a criticism I particularly level against the European left. And I think part of the reason we are in a crisis is because of that. But these are issues on which all of us have to think. Thank you very much.
It's a wonderful lecture covering virtually everything under the sun in such a coherent manner that I don't know, it's very difficult not to be convinced. Now the teacher that he is, I think he would be extremely hurt if he did not allow audience to interact with him. So now is the time for you to make comments, to ask questions. Feel free, because this is the time for us to discuss these issues. These are not issues which are abstract. These are not issues which are academic. They are issues which touch our lives in our countries. Okay, Q. Let's start with you, Prof.
Thank you very much for a fantastic, coherent lecture. And I want to support one of your arguments concerning the lack of absorption of the peasant eliminated from the land during the industrialization process in Europe. I think there are two further factors. The one is that life expectancy did not rise very much during this phase. And the other one, which has been looked into, was the First World War, or Germany, because there was an oversupply of young men in the countryside, which in a way also then made the First World War possible, that you had this cannon fodder that could be killed in the trenches, and the millions died there. And before that, Marx had already pointed out, was the Irish famine. So there were also additional factors that made it different from today. But I have a question concerning your vision. The issue is, are we not at a point of no return? For example, when we look at Bolivia, where the idea was we don't exploit the countryside and the international community should give us money. But the international community was not willing to do so. And so the city people in Bolivia then forced the president, who was actually coming from the countryside, to go into extractivism again, in a way. And the question I have for you is, in a way, since we have such big cities nowadays, will those city people actually support a different type of countryside, which might produce less food, especially in the transition period, and to different costs, because costs that should reflect the decency of living in the countryside? So that's my question, whether we are not beyond the point of return.
Thank you. Let's take a few questions and then come back to Prabhat.
Question, thank you.
Okay. Okay, let me go to the... I'll come back here. Yes?
Yeah, thank you.
It's trying to be short and concise.
Yeah, I'm privileged to be part of this lecture. I just have one question to make from a Marxist principle of transforming from a capitalist to a level where we go proletariat, where the industrial worker is the one who holds the economy. Now, this is where I've always gotten stuck when I'm trying to read this. You come to Africa, the industrial worker is almost not there, because even the one you call an industrial worker is, in fact, in my own terms, I call him a lumpen proletariat. In most cases, it's just in the industry, he doesn't know even what is happening there. So in our survivalism economics, which is preached by entrepreneurial sense, where young people are being now told to be innovative and come up with ways of survival. How then do we come up with this force to bring back egalitarianism by fighting primitive accumulation of capital, especially basing our forces on land? Because if you are to be an entrepreneur, land does not give a lot of that chance, because agriculture is almost a failure in Africa. That is what I want you to explain a little, and we see how we can get out of that.
All right. There was another hand there. If I come to this side, yes, please.
Thank you, Sam.
I'm just trying to make it just a short one. I would like to thank you for a very good presentation and for believing in Marxism. But in Zimbabwe, I very personal questions. We are still growing. In Zimbabwe, we say our land is our prosperity, and it's going to belong to us. We are that generation. We want it. So I'm saying, you say the revolution that is going to be brought by the proletariat is going to give them the land they want. This is from the Marxist perspective. In Zimbabwe, we have a problem that the land is being owned by the few, and those few, they came from somewhere. But if I can go back a little while from other book, maybe you have read it by Polanyi, that is called The Great Transformation. He said, the land belongs to the people. The land belongs to the landless. The land is for the people. So if I can try to make these ideological clashes for us here in Zimbabwe, we are landless. And that land belongs to us because we have been living on that land. But now, here comes these people, they came. They took the land. Now you are preaching redistribution. That redistribution to me is like a false hope to us. So my question is, for you as a professor, as an academician, what can you say about our situation in Zimbabwe as far as land redistribution is concerned? Thank you.
Can you bring anybody at the back? Can you bring the mic here?
Thank you. Prof, would you say we are now experiencing the reversal of this surplus labor from third world to Europe? I mean, if you look at the situation in Libya in particular, where a lot of people are dying trying to cross to Europe, and subtle, we find that most of the governments in the third world sort of like subtle try to promote people from living to Europe. Would you say we are now experiencing the reversal of that surplus labor from Europe to third world and now from third world to Europe? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think that now let's give chance to Prabhat.
These are very difficult questions. I'm very grateful that these questions are raised. Okay, let me just go. Yes, I agree with you about life expectancy did not rise, the effect of the First World War. There is also the view, Eric Hobsbawm argues this, that actually that 19th century industrialization was one which was very labor intensive. That actually, one of the reasons that you can say why Marx thought the organic composition of capital was going to rise was because machinery was more or less produced by bare hands. So, so it is possible that actually it absorbed more labor than contemporary industrialization. There are all these factors. Point of no return, if I believe that we have reached a point of no return, that would amount to my believing that we are doomed forever. I don't believe that, I don't wish to believe that. I believe that certainly, I think within globalization there is a tension which is absolutely visible everywhere between the urban middle class interests and those of petty producers, traditional petty producers and peasants and so on. I think the urban middle class in a number of places has been a beneficiary of globalization because of the spread of finance, because of the outsourcing of activities and so on, including countries like China and India and everywhere. But on the other hand, the peasantry has actually, and other petty producers have actually suffered. When I was in Kerala, I used to work in Kerala for a while with the planning board. We made a calculation, namely that suppose every fisherman was paid what is the statutory minimum wage of the Kerala government, then you find that actually that sector is in deficit. So that basically they were surviving by taking daily returns which were lower than even the statutory minimum wage of the state. So traditional petty producers have suffered, but urban middle class segments of it have done quite well. But I think there is a change that is taking place. I think because of the world capitalist crisis, the possibilities of generation of employment, even as far as the urban working class is concerned, is going down. In India, for instance, the number of people employed in the IT sector, and IT sector was the booming sector, has actually declined in absolute terms. And as a result, this gives an opportunity for progressive forces to put before people an alternative agenda of development compared to neoliberalism. Now, okay, industrial workers are not there. When you actually look at even the Chinese Revolution, true, it began with the Canton Commune and so on and so forth, but ultimately they retreated, away from the cities. Many people had predicted, including Leon Trotsky, for instance, that when Mao's Red Army would move into the cities, there might be a conflict between the peasant army on the one hand and the industrial proletariat on the other, because the industrial proletariat had been more or less outside the influence of the Red Army after the collapse of the Canton Commune and so on. But that was not the case. I think what you are saying is not just specifically true of Zimbabwe or countries in Africa, but everywhere, in a lot of third world countries, it is certainly the case that the industrial proletariat is quite small. Nonetheless, when one talks about led by the proletariat, what one has in mind is that certainly there is a trade union movement, and what is more, there is a certain ideology associated with the proletariat which transcends peasantism. Peasants, even when they believe in collectivism and so on, there is no kind of peasant consciousness transcending capitalism. It is a consciousness that can glorify a kind of collectivism that is pre-capitalist. But on the other hand, if you are thinking in terms of transcending capitalism, you would have to have a kind of vision. And that vision, even if the proletariat is small, is likely to take roots in the proletariat in an immediate sense, and then it may get transmitted to the peasantry. Certainly I think third world revolutions do suggest that. After all, where was the proletariat in Cuba? Where was the proletariat? Even in China, the proletariat was small. So one has to look at it not in terms of strictly the way Marx wrote, but look at it in much wider terms. Lenin, for instance, when he gave a call for Soviets, he said that in third world countries, what you need is not Soviets or workers, you need Soviets or working people, which is workers and peasants and others. All right, now, now you are saying that agriculture is a failure in Africa. I'm not really an expert on Africa. If you say so, then I would take it, but I just would like to raise two questions. I believe that agriculture being a failure in Africa, failure in quotes, is itself a result of the kind of development that is taking place. It's not a failure per se. If it is the case that actually people come out of agriculture because it's not profitable, because they are driven out or whatever, in that case, those left in the agricultural sector are people who are not really in a position to carry out agriculture the way that it could be carried out. And as a result, I think what you call failure is an ex post manifestation of the kind of economic policy rather than being a datum. Okay, so I would put that to you to kind of think about. And what is more, I certainly feel, I know that Africa's food crisis is entirely because of neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism actually has meant the substitution of a range of crops for the export market for food crops, which has undermined food security. This has happened over a long period of time. Initially, people are not bothered about it, but the moment you have a collapse of export crop prices, then you find the country doesn't have enough foreign exchange to import food, and what is more, even if the country imports food or gets food aid, the people don't have enough purchasing power to actually buy food. So I think African agriculture has to be looked at, not in terms of what actually is visible, but in terms of what underlies what is visible. All right. Land, okay. I mean, you are saying in Zimbabwe, land, Zimbabwe is one of the most successful examples of land reform anywhere in the third world. What you are saying, I would be more willing to accept in the case of South Africa. But on the other hand, okay, I'm an outsider, but I'd be less willing to accept in the case of Zimbabwe, because at least, okay, no matter how much fault you can find with the land reforms in Zimbabwe, the fact is that it has been one third world country which actually has done very substantial land reforms, and I think it has been vilified for that. All over the world, the noise against Zimbabwe is because of that. So I think we have to actually kind of give credit to the Zimbabwean revolution that it has actually redeemed at least a part of its promise. Okay, now there is the last of the questions I got is this about a reversal, about emigration. Throughout the history of capitalism, there has been the following picture. There were two huge streams of migration in the 19th century. One is the migration of tropical workers to other tropical countries. Indian, Chinese, coolie labor, indentured labor. I'm talking about the post-slavery period, okay? Post-slavery period. Coolie labor, indentured labor, I mean, all these West Indian cricketers like Rohan Kanhai or whatever, Alvin Kalicharan and so on, tropics to tropics. And then you have a migration temperate to temperate. Tropics to tropics migration was a low-wage migration because they were actually indentured and coolie labor. The temperate to temperate migration was a high-wage migration. The cause was not agricultural revolution in Britain, which is what Arthur Lewis says, but the cause was the fact that they actually got rid of the local Amerindians and then got hold of their land, etc. But these two migration streams, according to Lewis, 50 million each, were actually kept strictly separate. They still are separate. An Indian is not free to go to Australia. Not free to. So they are still kept separate. And consequently, what you are having now, and this separation was more or less accepted by everybody. What you are finding now for the first time is a struggle against this separation. You see, capitalism has always pushed people around, millions of people across the globe. Okay. Those coolies and indentured laborers who went from China or India and so on, they did not do so that one day you buy a ticket and go. They were actually taken there by agents in order to work in mines, plantations and so on. So capitalism has moved millions of people across the globe to its own satisfaction, for its own interest. And the people have moved without protest. They have acquiesced in this order in which there is a strict separation, and they simply are pushed around to go here and there. For the first time, you find that people are protesting against it. And I think while this protest is one which has cost lives and so on, I see it as an act of resistance. Okay. It's not reversal in the sense that they are not going to, it's not as if third world labor reserves are actually going to go north. That's not possible. To some extent, to the extent that capital is coming to the third world, that might generate some unemployment. Movement of capital is a substitute for a movement of labor, okay? But not sufficiently. And in any case, Trump is now going in for protectionism and bigger my labor policies, through which even this kind of migration of capital may be restricted somewhat. Even Obama had gone in for that, taxing people who are outsourcing activities. So I don't think there's going to be a reversal, but I see this as a resistance.
you very much, Prabhat. I don't know what to say. I think this was a fantastic lecture and covered many issues which we have been grappling with in all our summer schools and in other forums. And there's a lot of thinking there which I think we can learn from. And of course we have to, all theories are all the time being renovated given the particular situations. And today we are in a situation where we can talk about, instead of in addition to Worker Peasant Alliance, we can talk about a continuum of working people, from the petty peasant through to surplus labor, unemployed, through to street hawker, and through to women who work to supply food and so on, and construction workers, and a small person in the industry. So we have a continuum of working people. And I think Prabhat rightly pointed out, and this was one of the things that the Chinese Revolution was, that when you talk about Worker Peasant Alliance and working class leading, what was meant was the proletarian ideology leading the struggle in the sense of transcending capitalism. The peasant consciousness, as Prabhat pointed out, doesn't transcend capitalism. So these are some of the issues that we can formulate and draw lessons from and apply to our reality. Once again, Prabhat, thank you very much, first of all, accepting our invitation to come in this lecture, and you have set a very high standard, and I hope that our future memorial lectures would equally stand up to this expectation. Thank you very much, and I think it will be